What did we used to call three average white guys?
A podcast. Hello and welcome to The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in the wine and food world. I'm your host, Catherine Cole, joined by co-host Martin Reyes, a Master of Wine, international wine consultant, winemaker, importer, and educator. So, Martin, the first episode you ever joined The Foretop for as a panelist was episode 84, which we called Time for Change in the Wine Industry. That was back in December of 2020, and I am thinking back to that episode right now as we get ready to record this one.
You're right, Catherine. I was thinking about that too. It was my first Foretop appearance, and we had talked about the uproar over the centralized power dynamics that spawned sexual harassment in our trade, and also what seemed to be a fairly institutionalized racism and sexism at an elite sommelier organization. And almost years gone by, and we're ending our wine season by reflecting on how the wine industry has or hasn't changed since then.
That's right. And we have two guests with us who have done a lot of thinking about these topics, and I'm so pleased they were able to join us. Rania Zayyat is the founder of Lift Collective, a nonprofit committed to equity, inclusion, and representation in the wine industry, and also the wine director at Bufalina in Austin. Welcome, Rania.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Rania, I'm so happy that you're here. It's one of my silver linings, I think, for many of us in 2020, was getting to talk to you, work with you, and getting to know your mountain-moving, amazing work that you've done. And this past October, you were announced as a wine enthusiast top 40 under 40 in the wine industry. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a long year, but it's nice. It always feels good to feel recognized for the work that you're doing.
Yes. And you know what? Continuing silver linings of 2021, Miguel de Leon. Okay, Miguel is a brilliant writer covering issues of social justice and inequality in the wine industry. And for me, writing some mind-expanding articles. And he's also the wine director at Pinch Chinese in New York. Welcome, Miguel.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me. It's nice to hear that I write okay. My mom would be very proud.
We should mention that everyone is a winner here because, Miguel, you won the 2021 Wine Access New York Sommelier Award. So we just have an all-star cast today.
Hey, if we can all get our flowers the right way while we're still here, and if we're giving it to ourselves and each other, I think that's fine to celebrate.
Well, welcome to you both.
Yeah, welcome to you both. And as Martin mentioned, Miguel, you've been writing some really thought-provoking pieces. One that got a lot of attention was an essay you published in June of 2020. It was called Actionable Items for the Wine Community, and we'll put that up on our social media feed. And it was a really clear laundry list of ways in which the wine industry can change to be more inclusive and more equitable. And maybe for our listeners, you can recap some of the main takeaways of that essay. And we'd love to talk about how is the industry doing since you published that? And where have you seen progress since you published it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article itself, Actionable Items in the Wine Community, it's a 5-item manifesto, you could say. And it was a step-by-step example to make it as clear as possible, as quickly as possible, so that people didn't have any more excuses about how to fix this thing because they didn't have the resources. Working in a restaurant made me absolutely be a sucker for SOPs. And so standard operating procedures like that just made it absolutely easy for me to say, is there a checklist of things that I can do to make myself better as a person? Or how can I prevent these things in the industry from happening in the future? And the way that I addressed that was to basically have a 5-point summary of how I was feeling as a person of color in wine. And I can recap that very quickly. Number 1 was, in spaces where you don't see us, bring us in. And number 2, in spaces where you can see us, make the space for us, hire us, and invest in us. In spaces that you have made for us, please ensure our safety with your support. Hold others accountable for their lack of action. And lastly, in spaces that don't want us, dismantle those spaces. And so it sounds like a very big philosophical argument to make for the state of the wine industry at the time. But I broke it out into different sectors and how we can maybe look at these things a little bit differently, right? Maybe as educators or as vendors or as retailers, there are ways that we can engage with wine and use it as a lens in order for us to make our spaces better for ourselves and for each other. A year in, I will say, we're still tackling a lot of similar problems, but at least the conversations are being had. And at the very least, we're able to start to create spaces that are a lot more brave and a lot more commanding of the right kind of attention. I mean, a good example would be Rania's conference earlier this year called Lift Collective, where it was one of the first places that we'd seen codes of conduct be implemented well and thoughtfully throughout the entire conference to make sure that everybody who was participating wasn't just conducting themselves in a fine manner, but also that there was something past just being in the conference, right? Like I think like the codification of the interactions were so that everybody was excited to be there, excited to see what was happening next, and really working with each other well past the connection points. So that's something that I'm really, really excited about, that we don't have to really worry about much now. What we do have to worry about now in terms of the organizing would be from the very beginning, making sure that we can do as much as we can as individuals first, and then kind of coalescing into an unorganized group talking about these systemic changes.
That's so interesting that because you have this operating procedure from restaurant work, that you were able to apply that to making positive change in the restaurant industry. And so true about events like the Live Collective. But I'm wondering, on the restaurant floor, I mean, it's been such a strange couple of years in the industry, but I'm wondering, Rania and Miguel, have you seen actual changes within restaurants?
I think the biggest change is that because of COVID, the lack of impetus for workers to get back into the restaurant work because of the power dynamics that are inherent between customer service and tipping. And so one of the things that we're seeing, for example, is not just a labor shortage, because it's not a labor shortage. We also have to remember that about 500,000 people died this past year. A lot of them also worked restaurants. And so there's a reason why we're not seeing the same kind of robustness within our own industry. What's interesting, though, is that the people who are choosing to come back are really committing themselves to this kind of idea that this is going to be better spaces for our workers, or better spaces within our own groups who are working with each other. A couple good examples would be obviously, we talked about the elimination of tipping as a constant point, but it's past that now, and like really getting employees a living wage that is standardized throughout the rest of the country. Obviously, President Biden's $15 promise is starting to come true, but we also know that the cost of living adjusted for bigger cities, say like New York and Los Angeles, should really be closer to $25. And so things like that, and obviously like a bigger workers' rights movement informed by this kind of power dynamic change is going to be, I think, the biggest thing that's going to be happening to us to look forward to.
You know, I think it's an interesting dynamic right now, because I think there was always a divide with how people viewed restaurant or hospitality workers. It's almost magnified at this point because of the pandemic. You know, historically, restaurant workers have been looked at as sometimes party goers, people who don't have a serious career. This isn't my real job. There's always been a really interesting viewpoint taking hospitality work seriously. And now that a lot of people are refusing or holding off on going back to work because they don't want to settle for crazy schedules, lack of benefits, just the emotional labor that you go through as a hospitality worker. I feel like now a lot of people are viewing us as even lazier. Like now these people don't want to go back to work. And I think it is a really great refresh and a really great starting off point again for us to implement more changes. And for instance, in our restaurant, for the first time, we're able to offer access to a direct primary care physician for all of our staff and pretty much cover all of the expenses for that. And we're also adding a 3.5% healthcare charge to all of our bills. We've offered free counseling through a local nonprofit, but I think that people are expecting better now. They don't want to go back to these sort of substandard living conditions. And as cost of living continues to go up, food prices are going up on the wholesale side, and then people don't want to have that fee passed on to them with rising menu prices. So there's just a lot of different things to tackle, but I do think that there are a lot of good things that are going to come out of this, and hopefully that just means a better standard of living for hospitality professionals.
You know, Rania, there's a lot of issues that come to a head in the hospitality and restaurant area. I think because it's a pressure-filled environment, and all the thoughts that Miguel and you, Rania, mentioned are more visceral, right? And also the power dynamics around wine, around service, around sommelier culture. Wine is already intimidating, right? And exclusive for consumers to some degree. And it's even worse in a way for employees working in this field. I'm just wondering, do you think that issues of sexual harassment and assault have been adequately addressed in this field?
Personally, don't. It's a heavy question. I feel that while there's certainly more awareness, right, there have been a lot of celebrity chefs and restaurant groups called out for harboring those types of environments, and organizations as well. I've talked to a lot of women that I know, especially after some big scandals, that felt like they were being marginalized, that they were being made to feel like they were guilty in some way for bringing on that type of abuse to themselves. I think that for anyone that's shaking up the status quo and saying that we're not going to settle for this anymore, I think that there still are a lot of issues. I would like to see more zero tolerance policies in place in all businesses in the wine industry, and also within the hospitality industry. I think that the type of treatment that some hospitality professionals get from guests still isn't adequately addressed, especially in an industry where margins are so low. You know, business owners sometimes feel like they might need to prioritize pleasing guests over taking care of their own staff. That is something that I feel like there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, that is a difficult dynamic with the restaurant industry. If the guest is always right, then the guest can be a total cad and get away with it. And
Catherine, to address that a little bit, right? I think what we're seeing now as a shift socially is that caveat is holding less and less true as the days pass, is that the customer isn't always right. And I think what we're trying to do, I don't intend to speak for you, Rania, but I do want to say that we're reframing the question so that the customer isn't always right. They can come first. Absolutely. Whenever you're in my space, you can come first. You're there to spend your money for an experience that I'm offering at the end of the day. But you're not always right. We're also reframing this idea of what guest means, to be a good guest or how to be a better guest. Mm-hmm. Is that ultimately when we talk about that relationship, when you look at the linguistics of that relationship, right, is that you're a guest invited to my home. And as a guest in your home, for example, I would hope to be invited as many times as possible. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go rifling through your medicine cabinet, do you know? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the biggest things now, is that we're also reclaiming that as workers, in that if someone's acting untoward you, now there's a much more vocal group of people who are also going to be defending you as a person who is inviting others into their home, and people who are understanding that bad behavior like that isn't actually anything that's supposed to be okay. And that's coming from both sides. You know, now management's being trained in terms of advocacy and allyship work, but at the same time, understanding that other guests can be accomplices for you as well when they see something bad happening, that they can step in and say, I don't like what's happening here. This is supposed to be an enjoyable place for everybody. And I've seen that happen firsthand, obviously throughout the pandemic. Unfortunately, supply lines and a couple of things just haven't been up to par of what they were before. And I don't think they ever will. But it's taken a lot of patience for myself, but also the understanding that a lot of other people are trying to be just as patient with us in terms of that kind of sea change.
Sometimes I think restaurant menus should just have like small print at the top of the menu that just says, we have a no asshole policy.
Yeah. Do you remember the times of the signs where it said, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone? Signs were everywhere.
Yeah.
And then they disappeared for a while, and then this thing kind of crept up again. And then now we're back to that same place where maybe it's not as strongly worded because that sounds like a legal threat. But maybe this time it's a little bit softer where we're like, just don't be a dick.
Yeah.
So Rania, as the founder of Lift Collective, I'm sure you hear a lot from folks who are still dealing with issues of equity, inclusion, or worse, blind spots from organizations who believe they are doing the right thing. So after all this reckoning that we've done, who has been left behind and how can we bring them in?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. One of the biggest areas for improvement certainly is in supporting entrepreneurs. And I feel really strongly about this simply because, as we're talking about dismantling institutions and organizations and spaces that have intentionally ignored much of the wine community, I've been really pushing and hoping to see a lot more people be able to start building their own spaces. And through that, you have to have resources, financial resources, mentorship resources. You have to have access to capital and to have a support group. And I feel like this has been really difficult, specifically for women of color in the industry. And one of the things that we're trying to do through our organization is continue to expand our entrepreneurial scholarship and support program, because we really think that there's so many steps in starting your own project, but I really think that having a strong group of people who can support you, even just through simple questions, frustrations, can really have a really big impact on how people feel like they're able to move forward. And the more that we invest and the more new businesses that are created, I think the more opportunities we're going to have for a more equitable industry.
Lift Collective, right? It's a relatively new title for the group that you originally founded to support women. And you've since developed a larger umbrella, really. What made you feel like more groups needed your support, and what issues do they continue to face?
When we started, the organization was originally called Wonder Women of Wine and started in 2018. And initially, we were advocating for gender equality. And this was right in the thriving part of the Me Too movement. And it felt really important to empower women, because I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the past couple of years, they're commonplace now, but I think a few years ago, they were not talked about. Sexual harassment, racism, these were not conversations that I think were on the forefront. And so we wanted to start generating awareness. And I think that we did that with Wonder Women of Wine. But after some time, it became clear to us that advocating for women wasn't enough, that there were so many people and so many other groups and communities in the industry that were suffering essentially from the same root problems that women were, and that there is so much nuance and intersectionality and complexity to these issues that we didn't really feel like we could go on doing that work without expanding our mission and really advocating for anyone who's ever been harmed or ignored. This has been a time of learning for so many of us. And I think that the organization is also a reflection of how our team has grown and learned over the past couple of years. And we feel that we can do that publicly and also create educational opportunities for everyone to sort of learn with us on this journey and understand that we all have a part to play in creating change. And what we did 6 months ago doesn't define who we are today. Today is always a great day to do something different and to advocate for others.
I'm struck that you use the word subtleties, and then you were just speaking about learning, because I think so much of this conversation is about subtleties. It's about sort of recognizing those 1,000 tiny cuts. And even before we started recording, we were all laughing about a question of subtlety, which is, when do you pronounce a word in the accent of the language of origin? For example, why do we say Pinot Noir instead of Pinot Noir? And then we were talking about, shouldn't we be pronouncing most Spanish words with a Spanish accent because the US speaks so much Spanish? And it's one of those questions that can devolve into a question of, oh my gosh, am I being racist by pronouncing something right or pronouncing something wrong? And even if it's something you're laughing about, it's a constant process of self-education and thinking and learning and asking questions and sort of not being afraid to delve into those subtleties. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what it feels like. So it sounds like that's kind of the process you've been going through with Lift Collective.
Yeah, I mean, I will not shy away from saying that I think at our organization at the very beginning certainly played into a lot of white feminism, and that was something that I learned in the process of doing this work. I didn't know what I was doing when I started. I just knew that I wanted to see change. And that was, important to me, just to go out and start doing something. And I've learned, I feel like, an infinite amount, but also acknowledging that there's still so much that I don't know and that we don't know and that we're learning together. And what I've really loved about working with other organizations and people in the past year is that we have created these spaces where we feel safe in kind of understanding what we don't know and sort of learning together. And I think that that's so important to have those spaces so that people don't shy away from wanting to do the work because they're fearful of being called out or being canceled. I think having more spaces to be called in really made a big difference and a big impact on me personally, and also what we're doing as an organization.
I love the inclusivity of that approach.
For what Rania said, in terms of, making spaces for us safe, that's one thing, right? We know how to take care of each other well, because I feel like in this collective trauma that we're experiencing, minority experiences tend to coalesce because there's always something that we can relate to in terms of how we've been othered or how we feel differently. I think what we have to do as educators in that space is maybe confront you with a little bit of that discomfort. It's absolutely fine for you to feel gross and icky for a little bit if you're going to understand the ramifications of the thing that you're doing. The work is uncomfortable. It is unnecessarily uncomfortable, but it has to be wonderfully necessarily comfortable at the end of it, because now we're able to ask these kinds of questions continually. We're also able to shift the conversation in a way where I don't think that we would have had a conversation this easy flowing maybe a year ago, even talking about these things, because we would have been just like, am I saying the wrong thing? Do I think this is the right way to approach it? It's absolutely fine. If we're going to talk about justice and equity in a way that is meaningful and equitable and actually restorative, we should absolutely be fine in terms of wondering how to move these barriers, or I guess these like distinctions of comfort, because they're always couched in a power dynamic that we can't shift by ourselves.
What Miguel just mentioned in terms of having meaningful conversations that then become restorative and to uncover your blind spots is something that happened to me with Rania watching the whole thing. With Lift Collective's summit several months ago, in which we were brought in as panelists, and there was definitely a learning curve for me, and asking questions that were actually, in many ways, tone deaf. It was a point around what I call it is fluency, right? The fluency of diversity conversations, the fluency or lack thereof of understanding how to be inclusive, or the fluency, lack thereof, of recognizing how to foster a sense of community as opposed to inadvertently making someone feel excluded by the blind spots that you may or may not have. And
I mean, sorry to interrupt a little bit, Martin, but even there to say things that are blind spots and tone deaf, we're talking about ableist language here, right? And so maybe there's better ways that we can address those things. Maybe it's just something that you're unaware of. Maybe it's something that we need attention to be driven to. It's not anybody else's fault that they were born blind or deaf or however else.
Right.
And I think that there's absolutely a way that we can include all of those folks within our wine conversation. You don't need to see to taste wine. You don't need to hear to taste wine. And I think that that's some of the pleasures of how we navigate ourselves in this kind of conversation, is that there's always something that we can learn from each other, however diverse our background is. And it's exactly because they're experts in those through their lived experiences, not because a piece of paper was given to them that said, here, you have your card that says you're this kind of person. I am absolutely 100% aware of those kinds of issues. And I hope to make sure that like spaces like this and conversations like this can continue to be had where, I'm not slapping you on the hand to say, stop saying those things, but I am asking you to maybe consider who we're leaving out when we continue to speak about these things in conversation.
Oh, I absolutely, and I appreciate that. I appreciate you bringing that up, Miguel, because when we have a shared agreement between you, me, and Catherine and Rania, then it shifts the conversation forward. And rather than being shamed or feeling that little potential sting on the slap of the hand saying, excellent.
But I mean, exactly. Like if a light bulb can go off, it doesn't have to be painful.
Right. And I think it's about giving people too the benefit of the doubt initially, like you can't, sometimes people simply aren't aware.
Absolutely.
And you just, it's how you communicate that and present it to them is an opportunity for someone to say, oh, thank you for letting me know. And I didn't know that. And now I'm aware.
Yeah. It's considerations of our full spectrum of humanity, right? And kind of really trying to make as many of our people who we want to include in wine, which I think is everybody for all of us here in this group, is that from all walks of life, there are so many ways that we can approach wine because it gives us such pleasure. Like at the end of the day, wine is such a hedonistic thing to bring into the world because it's something that everybody can enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's its greatest superpower, right? That wine is automatically inclusive. We drink, get intoxicated slightly, and then we become more honest. And when we
Yeah,
become more honest in front of the other person,
absolutely.
we see them, we're more vulnerable, right? So it's bridge building, not bridge destroying.
Absolutely. And at a time where we're increasingly globalized, in a time where terroir feels a little bit shaky because climate pressure and all of these other things are happening, at least on the human aspect, we can consider each other a little bit more fully. And without having this kind of recourse where it's like, well, am I going to say something wrong? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? At the end of the day, it's like, if I can make you see something through something joyful, we've gotten to a place that's much better without having to exercise this muscle of like, here's another trauma that you're going to impose on somebody. Here's another something. Here's another something. It has to be optimistic. It has to be joyful because the work that we're doing at the end of the day feeds on joy. It feeds on human interaction.
And I will say too, moving into this type of work in the past couple of years, I think that personally speaking, I have found some of the best, most rewarding, most uplifting friends in the wine industry than I think I have ever found in my 10 years of working in wine. And so the people that are part of this movement, that are doing this work, are truly incredible humans. And I just have to put that out there because it really has made what can be very heavy and what is very heavy work so much more joyful, knowing that there is such a great community sharing this space.
Absolutely. That is a really lovely point at which to stop for our sponsor break. We're just going to take a little break, hear from our wonderful sponsor, and we will be right back. Well, I am feeling very lucky today because for our sponsor break, I get to pop a bottle that represents my two favorite styles of wine. This is the Grand Moraine Yamhill Carlton Oregon Brut Rosé. It's a blend of 57% Chardonnay and 43% Pinot Noir, vinified in the traditional method, that is the double bottle fermentation that is also practiced in Champagne. Selected lots of the base wine were aged in neutral French oak barrels for 3 months to add depth, complexity, and spice to the final blend. This single vineyard estate-grown wine then spent a minimum of 24 months en tirage. At just 5 grams per liter of sugar, this wine could actually qualify as an extra brut, which is really my happy place in terms of dosage. If you have no idea what I just said, don't worry about it. Just know that it's not a big, fat, sugary sparkling wine. It's very balanced. It's very crisp. It's very delicious. So Rachel and I have been sitting here sipping it, and I'm going to take one more sip. We're both going to take one more sip, and I'm going to ask her what she thinks. What do you think?
Yum. No, I think this wine tastes like apricots and honey, but like with kind of a pop to it. I mean, I love bubbles anytime, but I drink this wine all day.
Me too. It's delicious. Grand Moraine is a winery that prides itself for unconstrained experimentation, eschewing expectations, and unself-conscious innovation. And you can actually read about this particular Brut Rosé in a certain book called Sparkling Wine Anytime. You may have heard of it. But you're probably wondering how you can get a hold of a bottle of these delicious bubbles. The best way to do it is to make an appointment to visit Grand Moraine in Oregon's Willamette Valley, where you can see the open-air winemaking facility and vineyard and taste through the wines at a leisurely pace. Or have Grand Moraine delivered to your home with free shipping. Yes, free shipping if you use the promo code FOURTOP. That's FOURTOP. So go to grandmoraine.com to purchase your wine online, enter that promo code FOURTOP, and shipping is on the house. Thank you so much, Grand Moraine. Loving these bubbles. Please forgive me, but I do feel like these conversations often end up being about money. So I kind of want to go off on a tangent and share this interesting observation I have made over the years. And it's going to involve talk of the art industry. It's going to involve the sport of polo. I feel like there may be something fundamental about the institutional structure of the entire wine industry that is built upon favors and patronage. And I wonder if it's time to start scratching that and kind of seeing what's underneath it. To switch the conversation a bit from sort of the service, the restaurant industry, to the actual wineries. I've observed that for young winemakers to really break out and make it, and it's usually a he, either needs to have some sort of long destiny of family money and a family vineyard and an estate, or else this winemaker needs an investor, a patron, so to speak. And I actually observed this years and years ago when I was a journalist. Long story, in Chicago, I had to cover the sport of polo, which is totally unrelated, you would think. But the way polo works is these supposedly great polo players like Prince Charles, they're actually patrons, and they get to play on a team with these world famous athletes whom they pay to create these amazing teams for them. And so the best polo players in the world are these guys from like Argentina, and rich white guys fly them all over the world, and they create these teams, and then they get to play on these teams with them. And the rich white guys are called patrons, they're patrons. And I've seen that with the art industry as well, right? If you want to become a famous artist, you need a patron to start buying up your art and building you up. And I've realized over the years that this is exactly the way the wine industry works. I've seen young white guys going from being garagistes to proprietors of beautiful wineries. And increasingly, I am seeing women getting these opportunities too. But at least in Oregon, where I am, when you see a small winemaker go from just having a tiny little label to having their own winery, there is always a patron behind them. And I've been thinking about this word patron because we also use it in reference to restaurants. And I just wanted to throw that out to everyone, because I think a lot of these fundamental inequalities often come down to money and to favors and to patronage.
It's a challenging question because you're absolutely right, Catherine, that it is this comes out of the fact that the deep socioeconomic, structural, systemic inequality feeds this, right? So you're absolutely right that it takes a lot of money to create and produce a wine or a winery. It takes a lot of money to create and run a restaurant, and a lot of risk. And you're absolutely right that the field has been that way. In my personal life too, I recently did an interview where I was asked what was that point of shift for me, and it was the patronage of a very high-end retail shop in Napa that gave me a position as a buyer that took a chance, quote unquote, took a chance on me, right? That really shifted my career into the possibility for, quote unquote, the bigger leagues. And the same thing happened almost 10 years later in 2016, where a white wealthy individual generously gave me the opportunity to run a winery. So my career is a direct result of that. I am still grappling with what that means, still want to learn how to what to do about that and what to say and how to feel. And then also, of course, the most important thing is how to bring access to individuals who could also benefit and who could be amazing winemakers or amazing wine estate vintners or amazing restaurateurs or chefs or owners of restaurants, and threading through the needle of what is a deeply institutionally uneven playing field for the groups that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think, Rania, you were speaking about this earlier because you were saying, how do we change the situation we're in? And the first thing you said was support entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a fundamental way for us to increase equity in the industry. And I often think about Lift Collective co-hosted a job fair called Be the Change. That was the first wine industry job fair that focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the reasons that we wanted to start that was because I feel like in the interview and hiring process, you often hear people talk about, to me, it almost sounds like all lives matter when people say, you know, I just want the best person for the job. I don't care about what you look like or what your gender is, just want the best person for the job. But I think that statement is seriously flawed because it does not take into account the unearned privilege that a lot of people have that have gotten them the jobs that they've had or the education that they've had that ends up on their resume. And so even if you were to strip away someone's name or photo or something like that, that resume still tells you a lot about privileges that people have had. And maybe it's better education, maybe it's a higher paid position or stability, even job stability can have a part in that. And so, yeah, the more that we empower and invest in people who have been underserved and ignored in our communities, that is one way that we can give back. Saying maybe they don't have all the skill sets or the qualifications right now, but what can I do to get them there? That's part of giving back and really investing and doing our part to make the industry more equitable.
Yeah, I mean, the fallacy of meritocracy is in order to achieve that merit, you have to be supported to get there. It's so hard to wrap my mind around how to get these wealthy folks who just want to own a restaurant or own a winery, or instead supporting scholarship programs for really promising folks who just don't have access. Like, how do we bridge that gap? I know all of you are doing so much work in this space, but I feel like so much more needs to be done.
There always seems to be more work to be done, Catherine. I think ultimately the question that we have to answer, at least with investment, patronage, and financial empowerment, is how willing are the people to get out of the way when we're talking about ownership from the beginning? To address Rania's question of privilege, I ask this again. There was another piece that I wrote last year called How to Dismantle White Supremacy in Wine.
That was my favorite one, by the way.
Thank you. And one of the questions that I posed there is, how willing are you to get out of the way for BIPOC to lead? Are you willing to hand over the reins? Because ultimately, that's the question that we're asking, right? Is that how can we involve more people? Well, we can hire more people. We can invest in these folks. But then we don't answer the question past that, right? So we don't even say, how can we, after the step of tokenization, how do we go past that? How do we make sure that there are more people who look like them, who feel like them, who understand and think like them in our own spaces? It's the reason why we all like working with each other, because we know that there's something inherently different about us in this space, and why we can ask certain questions a little bit easier about each other and to each other than going to, a white savior who's going to be like, oh, this is what you should do because I'm going to fix you. That's not what we're asking here. What we're asking is, have you asked us what we need from the beginning? Will you throw your support for us and in defense of these BIPOC leaders 200%? And then how willing are you to actually get out of the way for these spaces to thrive?
Miguel, you bring up a great point. I think you just crystallized it, because getting out of the way implies that you stop and you listen. For a great conversation to be had, you need to get out of the way of the other person's voice, right? You have to listen, right? And so it's not just teaching and telling people, hey, I'm going to bring you in and fix you, but it's like, hang on, we know that in nature, monocultures are weaker than polyculture, right? We also know, if you dig, it doesn't take much to see and hear studies that show that the diversity in voices, the diversity of opinions, and diversity XXX on multiple levels actually promotes a more nimble, a more dynamic organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a winery, whether it's a restaurant, or whether it's paper making company, right? If there's a group think of the board of directors or the CEO, et cetera, they're not as creative. The businesses are not as robust, and they're not as nimble as they can be to adapt to change, and to adapt to a changing world, and to adapt to a diverse set of clients, of customers, right? So part of this getting out of the way and part of this listening is actually acknowledging that it makes business sense. The economic incentive is there. Without the economic incentive, we have the work becomes harder. We have to convince people to do good, not just do well. I'm suggesting, and Miguel, I think that if I can take your notion a little bit further, I'm suggesting that we can say you can do well as well, not just do good, but doing good actually makes you perform better as a whole.
I mean, I agree with that 100%, Martin. When we talk about doing good, capital D, capital G, doing good. Right. At the end of the day, it serves us good wine, capital G, good wine, too. In the same way that if we treat our land better, we immediately sense a taste of quality go up in wine. The same thing happens with our sense of humanity when we take something into account with wine and wine products. And I think that that's very clear. If someone's treated well, they're going to make their wine better. And so at the end of the day, if we're doing more and more things like that for more and more people, why would we not want the most delicious thing be made by the most delicious, trains of thought here? Because there's 100% an outcome that is way more exciting, way more alive, with a lot more energy. And to me, I've considered wine as a product of intent this entire time. It's 100% human choices fueling all of these decisions to get us to somewhere delicious. To get to human decisions that get us to just this point of deliciousness means that we're also not considering so many other ways to get even more deliciousness out of that bottle. And so ways that we can consider that would be absolutely giving somebody financial equity, financial empowerment, ownership. But it's also reconsidering what we're doing if we're involved in a foodway that doesn't talk about reparations for Black people. We don't talk about ceding land back to Native Americans whose this land was stolen from. Those are all terroir questions at the end of the day as well. And those are bigger questions that we're not asking yet, at least in the industry sphere, because again, someone feels like they're going to lose out if they have that conversation. And so that's the point now, is that I think we're at a very interesting flashpoint with wine, because all the other things that coalesce with wine and its bigger inherent structural problems, we're absolutely willing to face, because this generation of drinkers has absolutely nothing to lose.
Yeah, and I think to sort of harp on that winemaking perspective too, I mean, so much of the conversation around, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the past year and a half has really been, I think a lot of companies have wanted to start, focusing on that, right? And you've seen people hire DEI officers and have departments and ERGs and employee resource groups. But really, it's sort of like taking an approach of sustainability in winemaking, from the social, environmental, and economic impact. It doesn't really work or do much if it is not fully ingrained into the foundation of your company. And so it's important to not separate it out and have one person or a couple people in charge of it if it's not literally written into the code of your business from every step of the way. So, if you're talking about winemaking, then it's about how we are farming our vines, how we are supporting and investing in farm workers and laborers, all the way up until the finished product, minimal intervention. So it has to be part of every step and component of your business, including who you do business with.
I like the holistic view that this conversation is taking, starting with Martine's comment about a polyculture versus a monoculture, and what you're saying, Rania, about making it just part of the whole company ethos. Because I think one mistake maybe we've been making in the wine industry is thinking, oh, the wine industry is this old, staid, white guy industry, and so we have to change it. But what if we just take a step back and say, what are the things that excite us most about wine? We get excited about field blends. We get excited about rare indigenous grape varieties. We get excited about polycultures. These are all the things that make wine richer. And if we just have this full sort of holistic mindset that diversity in in grapes, in vines, in nature, in our staff, all these things make the wine industry richer. And maybe wine is a field that actually celebrates diversity in all of its forms, whether it's in grapes or human beings.
This point right now takes me back to something, I think, Miguel, you said this earlier about how the conversation is evolving. We are having a different conversation now than we would have had 6 months ago, than we would have had 6 months before then. And if you keep going back in time, you see the education. For instance, the word sustainability for a number of years just meant environmental resilience, right? Environmentally being sustainable. The fact that you are challenging people's preconceptions means that the conversation is evolving. And then once you've reset that comfort zone, what do you do next? You look for the next expansion of comfort zone where you continue to make comfortable what was initially uncomfortable. Every time we bring in the conversation somebody who has been left behind, that we think, okay, now it's your turn. Behind them, there's somebody else who's still left behind. There's still somebody else who can be part of this broader wine community. Everybody deserves both the ability to afford a good bottle of wine if they wanted to, but also visit wineries or being able to afford a meal at a restaurant with a nice glass of wine. So there's socioeconomic levels here that are still, to be uncovered. And that's what gives me hope, right? That there's mountains of work. Miguel and Rania have already moved many mountains. They can keep moving them. They can find new ones to move and find new ones to recreate the landscape That's what's awesome, I think, about all of this.
That is a wonderful positive note on which to wrap this up. I think it's time for our dessert course. Rania, did you bring a dessert item to share?
I was going to talk about a show that I actually am a little late to the game. I just started watching. Is High on the Hog. And it is one of the best written, best narrated, best visual food shows that I've seen in a really long time.
It really is the best show. Steven Satterfield is actually also a guest on the Four Top this season.
Oh, exciting.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Miguel, did you bring a dessert wine course for us?
I did. I love to cook at home, especially Filipino food. This is the stuff that I grew up on. And I found this very lovely cookbook called Milkier Pigs and Violet Gold, which weaves food stories and folklore with recipes through Filipino food. And I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful way to look at something that like I thought was my culinary heritage, but it actually just goes way, way deeper than that. It talks about this idea of Filipino cuisine coming as a group of people rather than, the idea of being Filipino as actually also a picture of diversity instead of something that's not a monolith. That's one of my favorite books to kind of just peruse and also cook with.
Miguel, thank you. I want to read that book. I grew up in elementary school in San Diego, K through 8th, where the majority of people were Filipino. And so I would go to Filipino parties all the time. There's always be pancit and lumpia and adobo. So I feel a special affinity, also because of the Spanish influence too, of this food. So I'm definitely want to check this book out. Sounds
so good. How about you, Martin?
Well, I'm hopped up right now on caffeine, but in a good way. And I figured I just ordered this book. I ordered it for a few of my friends, and I want to tell you guys about this book called The Coffee Lover's Bible. Coffee Lover's Bible: Change Your Coffee, Change Your Life. Especially for people that think they know all there is to know about coffee. It's like, well, I don't need that book. I know what I need to know, right? And this is to me potentially a game changer for how to have a better relationship and pick the right coffee beans and the right format and this is science based. How to get the right kind of energy without the spike in your system. I definitely recommend this for anybody who loves coffee. The Coffee Lover's Bible: Change Your Coffee, Change Your Life. Sound like an infomercial.
I love that title. Oh my gosh, that sounds like a life changer for sure. My dessert item, as listeners maybe know by now, I do like a good historic fiction break from the world. And I am currently reading a book called The Lost Vintage by Anne Ma. That's M-A-H. And it takes place in Burgundy, and it's a present day story, but also kind of a flashback to World War II. I'm sure many of us have heard very interesting stories about wines and people being hidden in wine cellars in Burgundy. And this story has a lot of that. I'm not quite sure how it's going to end up. I'm still halfway through, but Anne Ma, the author, I believe, is a food writer. And so if you've read any wine fiction, sometimes it can be terrible and the details can be quite wrong. I don't know how else to put it. She seems to be very well informed and know what she's talking about. So far, I'm finding it to be very enjoyable. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. You can find Rania Zayyat online at liftcollective.org, and you can find Miguel de Leon online at migueldeleon.com. And there's a hyphen between Miguel and de Leon. And Martin, where can our listeners find you?
They can find me in a few different spots. Obviously, what I've said before at reyeswinegroup.com. That's my consultancy for multidisciplinary expertise in the trade. But especially for this one, I think people can feel free to go to wineunify.org.
Wonderful. And you can find me, Catherine Cole, at catherinecole.com. But I would prefer that you go to the4top.org and check out our website, listen to back episodes, get in touch with us via social media, and send us your questions and your thoughts about this episode. Tweet at us, Instagram us. Please get in touch. Also, we would love it if you would please subscribe to The Four Top on your favorite podcast app and leave us a rating so that others can find us. Thanks, everyone. Signing out here from the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon. Wonderful episode. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
This has been the Four Top Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer. Izzy Kramer is our senior producer. And I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor, Michelle Richards, our production assistant, Rachel Grossman, and our social media assistants, Lex Rule and Nick Toole. Please visit our website, thefourtop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Four Top on iTunes, NPR One, or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.
Oh, wait a minute. Are you still there? Oh, well, if you're still listening, then I need to tell you something. I need to tell you about the fabulous swag over at sparklingwineanytime.com. Sparkling Wine Anytime is, of course, your favorite new book about all things bubbly, but it is also a wonderful website designed by our team, Lex and Rachel. And we have gifts and goodies galore for you. We have sparkling wine-themed beach towels, teas, cocktail napkins, fancy wine flasks, adorable tote bags, and more. And guess what? Your purchase will help to support a favorite cause of ours, Ahivoy, that's AHIVOY, check it out, which provides education and career training to vineyard stewards in the Willamette Valley. So it's a win-win for everyone, and who doesn't love sparkling wine anytime? Please head to sparklingwineanytime.com. We would love to see you there. Thanks. We love you all. You're wonderful. Kiss, kiss.